away. It'll be a sea of red Saturday in Columbus. Ohio State encouraging its fans to wear scarlet in the shoe. It's a Buckeyes program that has known virtually nothing but success in games like this one. They have dropped just 6 conference games combined since 2012. But Penn State's an ordinary conference team. Let's hear from both sides focused on the game's spotlight position.
He's had poise. He's a big, strong quarterback who, leads the team well and manages the game well and has a good makeup. I think he's got a bright future ahead of him.
They do a really good job of, I think they're approaching it a little bit like we've approached it with Drew with a first-year starting quarterback. And he's doing what he needs to do for them to be successful offensively and win games. We recruited him. We know a lot about him. We had a ton of respect for him out of high school and continue to, and think he's going to be, a challenge for us on Saturday as well.
Our big stat brought to you by Walgreens. You heard Ryan Day praising Aller. As good as he's been at avoiding mistakes, a lot's been made of Penn State's inability to break off big plays this year. But with him under center, this offense has done a remarkable job keeping drives alive. When needing 2 or fewer yards, they've converted nearly 86% of their run plays into first downs, a significant jump over last year and a massive one over 2 years ago when the run game was remarkably ineffective. In fact, it is their best percentage going back all the way to 2016. So, Jake, let's start there. And I think there's been a lot of hand-wringing over Penn State's inability to break off big plays so far. But we saw with those numbers there how good they have been in short yardage situations, which translates to keeping drives alive, which translates eventually to scoring points, which they've done at a higher clip than anyone else in the Big Ten. They're the highest scoring team in the league. So is too much being made, in your opinion, of the inability to break big plays? Can they do this against Ohio State? Can they matriculate the ball slowly down the field and win the game?
I do think it's probably getting a little too much attention or a little too much flack because really, can you do this against Ohio State? Well, the whole idea behind this is complementary football. You hear that word all the time. We'll talk about Penn State's defense. Fastest defense I've covered in college football all year long. They trust those guys to make plays. So really what Coach Franklin says is he wants to continue drives. He wants to move the chains. He wants to keep his defense fresh on the sideline. Here's the other thing about it, and I'll use an analogy that these fan bases know. So in order to get something, you have to give something up. It's a zero-sum game. Let's think about Jim Knowles' defense last year. Aggressive, downhill. What did he give up? A little bit of insurance in the back end, and that resulted in teams being able to expose them with explosive plays. So for James Franklin, he's saying, why would I have to give up too much? Don't get me wrong. He wants to have explosives, and they're going to try to call plays. They could use it this week. But he's perfectly happy moving the chains, right? He's not risking as much. Another stat to complement this is a stat called stuff rate. What does stuff rate mean? It means what percentage of your plays go for 0 or fewer yards when you call a run? Basically, how often do you go backwards? Penn State is second best nationally. They don't go backwards. So they may not get the 20, 30, 40-yard runs, but they're happy getting 2, 3, 4-yard runs, getting into third and manageable, and moving the chains. And that comes all the way back to the beginning point here, which is they feel they have one of the best defenses, if not the best defense in the country. They feel they have a young quarterback that can make the throws when the times call for it, and they're happy playing this football game.
It is interesting to me, like the Aller part of it really makes sense to me. I mean, I think the biggest area where it makes sense is when you talk about, hey, you're making trade-offs, you're giving something up to gain something else. The one thing they're not giving up is the football.
Great.
Right?
Exactly.
I mean, he has not thrown an interception yet as a college quarterback. It goes back to last year, too. So keep the ball, hold on to the ball. I do find it odd that in the run game they haven't broken those big plays because that would seem to be separate from the philosophy in the pass game. And it really flies in the face of what we saw last year, particularly from Nick Singleton, who was a big play running back a year ago. So is it just coincidence? Right? I mean, why wouldn't they be able to do it in the run game when they did it a year ago? And when I don't know whether you agree, but I feel like the offensive line is significantly better. The run the run stuff rate stat would
Yeah.
speak to that,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
why aren't they breaking those big runs?
So they are separate, but in the Venn diagram, there is a little crossover, right? Because if you aren't having explosives in the pass game, defenses can tend to be a little bit more aggressive. The safeties can come downhill. They can fill quicker. Northwestern, a couple weeks ago, their corners were just blitzing right away and being active in the run game. You have to beat that to maybe deter the defensive coordinators from calling those plays. But you said it. I know they're capable of it. I saw it with my own two eyes. Like, if you gave Singleton a gap, it didn't matter who he was playing. He was gone. Allen, same way. So I know they're capable of it. To get an explosive play, it's not just on the offensive line. The receivers have to get their heads in there. They got to get their hands dirty. They got to go crack some safeties, occasionally some linebackers, and sustain their blocks outside. And then off of that, again, if you can get some explosive passes, that will help your explosive runs because it'll give the defense more things to think about.
What about the flip side of this game? What are you most focused on with Ohio State?
I think this decides the game right here, and that is the Buckeye offensive line versus the defensive front of Manny Diaz. And by now, we have a large body of work to say, what defense does Manny Diaz have? I can put it simply. You got 11 guys on the field. A large percent of Penn State's defensive plays, there's 6, 7, or 8 guys all within a yard or two of the line of scrimmage. And then they'll play man coverage outside with Kalen King and Johnny Dixon. And sometimes they come, sometimes they drop out of it. Sometimes they drop, 3 guys out. Sometimes it's zero blitz. It's really confusing for teams. What we've talked about all year is this Ohio State offensive line and how really before we get to McCord or any other weapons, the offensive line is still progressing. They certainly have room to improve. The challenge this week is, can the Buckeyes offensive line, that includes the tight ends and the running backs in this story, and that's why the running back health is a big thing because Travion Henderson's a veteran. He's good in pass pro. Can they stop the blitzes from Manny Diaz's defense? Because if you can, here's what I know. As good as Johnny Dixon and Kalen King are, you don't want to dance with Marvin Harrison Jr. in one-on-one coverage for the entire game. So that is the number one thing to watch out for.
So the big question I would ask then, kind of as a corollary to that, is if you're Penn State, they've done a great job of getting pressure. We were talking about this yesterday, right? They've pressured 50% of the opponent's dropbacks. It's the highest percentage in the country. As you say, a lot of that has come with confusion. A lot of it has come with blitzes. You were talking earlier about trade-offs, about giving something up to get something else. Do you still come at it with the same approach if you're Penn State? Because you do have the fear of getting one-on-one with Harrison. The flip side is you've got an offensive line in Ohio State, which has shown that maybe it's not at the level that it's been in past years. And so perhaps you can confuse them and get in the face of Cal McCord.
The 2 things here. There's pressure, but equally important is the illusion of pressure. So they'll put 7 or 8 guys on the line of scrimmage, and they'll force your hand as an offensive line, running back, quarterback group. They'll say, hey, man, we got to go pass protection or slide right. Running back, you're off the right tackle to the backside. Or, hey, running back, you got the linebackers in the A gap. So they force your hand. But the illusion of pressure is key because all of a sudden they'll drop out of it. And what you do is teams will say, you're bringing zero pressure. I don't even want to try to protect this. I'll run a bubble screen, or I'll run a wide receiver screen, or I'll do something to get the ball out quickly. But just as soon as you do that, this defense will drop out of it, and they'll change coverage on the fly. So that disguise helps confuse teams too. Just to finish this up, we'd say the same thing last year. Like, this is Manny Diaz's defense last year. It's like, what, will you play one-on-one? Well, he did. He did. He put Johnny Dixon and Kalen King in one-on-one coverage with Marvin Harrison Jr. on 3rd and 4th down all game long. There's no fear from these guys, right? They're excited for this challenge. I'm excited, man. This is one of those matchups. Like, we're seeing the best wide receiver in college football going up against a really good secondary that has no fear. One-on-one coverage, this is football. Who's going to win for 60 minutes?
What about the run game component of it from Ohio State? It has been up and down here over the last couple of weeks, and you touched on it. A huge part of that is they haven't been healthy. I mean, they were down to Dallin Hayden and carried the ball the entire season. He ends up being their leading rusher against Purdue just due to attrition, although he's certainly a really good running back. You talked about Travion Henderson, whether or not you have him back. But how important is it in terms of when that defense is kind of pinning its ears back and going after you. How important is it to have established some sort of a run game to keep them off balance?
Critically important. Because if you can't run the ball, just quite simply, that puts you in 3rd and 7 or 8 or 10. Obvious passing situations. You have to run the ball to stay on schedule, get into 3rd and manageable, avoid 3rd down altogether. Because if you're in an obvious passing situation, that's the strength of Manny Diaz. Like, he'll get into these blitz packages and challenge you, challenge you to make a decision. There's another piece of this with, Travion Henderson being healthy and getting a healthy running back room. To go back to the Buckeye offensive line, they're not bad, but they're not to the standard that I think they're capable of and that we've been accustomed to seeing. So all that means is there's holes, but they close quickly. You're not able to sustain it. So you need a guy like Travion Henderson who hits it. He's fast. He's got that punch, that athleticism. And one final philosophical thing here. If a defense is all in the line of scrimmage and they're downhill just like Penn State, you don't want to run laterally because their speed will be able to follow you. If they're downhill, actually one of the best plays is to run right in the middle of it. You can get through that initial wall of defenders, and you got a lot of green grass. Travion Henderson had a touchdown last year just like that, right? So that's going to be a big piece of this, is to stay on schedule. And really, McCord, I don't think you want to put this game fully on his back. You want to play complementary offense.
And we've talked a lot about Penn State and where's the explosion there. That's been a whole lot of explosion from Ohio State in the run game.
Right.
They have the fewest rushes of 10 yards or longer of any team in the Big Ten.
Shocking.
Who would think that, right?
One other piece of this. It's not a run, but wide receiver screens can effectively complement a run. I expect a lot of wide receiver screens this week. Another fun thing to watch is the tackling of the secondary Penn State out in space against Marvin and Ibuka and some of those weapons.
Man, this is going to be an awesome game.
I'm fired up. Look at me. I'm fired up.
So excited. So much more to come here on our show, including... Happy to have Fox Sports lead game analyst Joel Klatt with us. You can also catch the Joel Klatt Show wherever it is you get your podcasts. Joel, you've got the huge one this week, Ohio State, Penn State. We'll get to that in a moment. But whenever you've seen a Big Ten team the previous week, I always like to start there. Biggest takeaways watching Michigan dismantle Indiana.
Michigan's really good, Rev.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to see them on film and to see how it plays out, what the philosophy is like, the schematics and the power and the size. And it's another thing to see it live and then to get around the team. The other part of this is that, when I get to go to a home venue and actually spend time around the coaching staff, spend time around some of the players and to see it and to feel the culture, it gives you a better idea of why a team is successful or maybe in some cases why a team is struggling. In this case, it was a case study in why a team is successful. This is a culture that has taken root really since that COVID year and the seeds of this sown by players like Hassan Haskins and Aiden Hutchinson and Andrew Vastardis and those guys, Josh Ross, another one. And what you're seeing now in this program is the fruition of those seeds, and the product of that. It's a program that they love each other, they work hard, and they are deep. And this is a team that is going to be really tough to beat. I know that none of that is on the field, but trust me, all of that stuff makes a huge impact, and it's going to be a tough team to beat.
They are really fun to watch, unless you're playing against them, in which case I'm guessing they're not a whole lot of fun at all. Oregon and Washington was a ton of fun to watch last week, too. You had two future Big Ten teams. It was a game that got incredible hype. It lived up to that hype with the Huskies pulling it out there at the end. We have talked a lot about West Coast football this year. The Pac-12 is as good as it's been in recent memory. USC, though, going on the road, losing Notre Dame. I understand they're still undefeated in the Pac-12, but when you combine that with the performance we saw from Washington, and we've had some question marks about the Trojans, do you feel like now Washington clearly the team to beat out west?
Yeah, and in fact, I think that we saw the two best teams in the Pac-12 play Saturday in Oregon and Washington. Because let's face it, if any of us watched that game and really looked at that environment and felt what was going on in that environment, I don't know if there are many teams, Michigan included, that could have gone there and won on Saturday in that environment, to face Michael Penix in that environment. So to get the game to where it was late, I thought was an incredible effort from Oregon. In fact, Rev, I come away from that game really a believer in both of those teams, Oregon and Washington. I think in large respect, we're probably headed towards a rematch of that matchup in the Pac-12 championship game. They don't have divisions, so we're not going to have some sort of lopsided championship game in Vegas at the end of the year. I think those two teams are the best teams, and in large part due to what we did see in South Bend with USC struggling a little bit. Oregon is a heck of a team, and I will tell you this, similar to Rev in the Big 12, right? Like, does OU really feel confident they could beat Texas again? I'm not sure. If you're asking a Washington fan, do you really feel confident that you could beat that Oregon team again? I'm not sure if they would have a lot of confidence in that either. That's how good the game was.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating then to see if you do have a rematch game and were Oregon to come away and win the game, how the CFP would look at them.
It would be a mess.
Yeah,
and it will be a mess, of course.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the fun of it, as we've discussed. Okay, let's get into your game this week, Ohio State and Penn State. I do want to just get into some X's and O's because I think you do a ton of film study getting ready for a game like this. So let's start with Ohio State has the ball. Like, what are you watching? What are the key matchups there?
Yeah, so the last week against Purdue, I felt like their game plan and even their style with which they were trying to run the football was much different. Their philosophy was a little bit different. Ryan leaned into the passing game on first and second down. I think that was because of some of the struggles that they had running the ball against Maryland, and they were down Travion Henderson and down Mayan Williams, and then all of a sudden Chip Trainum goes down in the game, and they're down to their fourth guy, Dallin Hayden, who, by the way, is pretty good every time he's gotten a chance to run the football. But it was a little bit different schematically. I think that what you're starting to see now is Ryan learn this group. And this has happened before, and you and I have talked about this before. Remember back in even the COVID season, they were struggling running the football with Trey Sermon, and then they found what was successful out of the pistol and more of the downhill run, and they leaned into that. Every year, Ryan's going to find what his group does best and lean into those strengths, and I think you're seeing that right now with this group for Ohio State. This is going to be a pass-happy offense. They're going to lean on Kyle McCord, who's playing really outstanding right now. They're going to lean on Marvin Harrison. And albeit they don't have Emeka Egbuka, which is a bummer, but they've got Xavier Johnson, they've got Cade Stover, they've got Carnell Tate, they've got Julian Fleming. They have to throw the ball early and often in order to open up the run game later.
Going to have to protect him because there's no team that puts pressure on the quarterback at a higher rate nationally than Penn State does. We know how good that defense is. What about the flip side? What about when Penn State has the ball against the Buckeyes D?
Yeah, so the Penn State offense has been interesting to me because I don't know if they've just been cautious and vanilla or not wanting to be aggressive because they haven't needed to be aggressive. But Rev, I thought we would see more downfield passing to this point. I really did. With what Drew Aller does well and his just God-given ability to throw the football, which is off the charts. I thought that with their run game and their ability to throw it with him, that they would be run, and then play action and take shots. And that hasn't come to fruition. It actually resembles more of what we have seen from Penn State over the last few years under Sean Clifford. And I'm curious to see if that starts to evolve. Have they been holding things back? Do they want to take shots? Because right now they've only had one play all year of over 40 yards. That's one of the fewest in all of college football. And one of the blueprints of the way to beat Ohio State, at least this was the blueprint a year ago with Michigan and Georgia, is to get explosive plays on offense. I don't think that Penn State can just roll into the shoe and think that they're going to methodically just beat Ohio State by taking the dink and the dunk. They're going to have to throw the ball down the field and get aggressive with Drew Aller. And so my question is, how does that manifest? Is it going to manifest? And how will he play in really what I would deem as his first big start of his career?
Yeah, that's what's really interesting, right? That Kyle McCord does have that experience, whereas Drew Aller hasn't been in a game like that. It is fascinating because we have wondered a lot about Ohio State. They've yet to give up a play of 40 yards or longer this year. They got torched in those games at the end of last year against Michigan and Georgia. Maybe Penn State doesn't threaten you in that way, like to your point, kind of based on what we've seen this year. That isn't their strategy here coming in. I want to ask you one question about the coaches before we go. Mm-hmm. Both of these coaches are under immense pressure. That's just kind of the nature of each of these jobs. Who do you think needs this win more?
I would say Ryan Day. And I know that the record would suggest differently because if you actually look at the numbers, Coach Franklin and Penn State are the ones that have actually struggled more in these games, and this game in particular, than Ryan Day and Ohio State. Ryan Day is 51-6. He's won 9 top 10 matchups. So like this, beating 9 top 10 teams. He's excellent. And yet, and I hear, and we experience the narrative that the Ohio State fans build, which is they want it now and they want it all. And it's never good enough. And so being at home and being a team that's a more veteran team than what Penn State is, I think presents some pressure, in particular with the way that Michigan looks this year. Because there's this sentiment that Michigan, as the 2-time defending Big Ten champ in that division, that this game is for that next spot, or who's going to be the challenger to go face the champion later in the season. And for Ohio State fans, it will be unacceptable to be in third position. And so for those reasons, I think that Ryan Day would probably be under more pressure just because of his fan base than James Franklin, who's got a younger team, who's on the road, and probably a year away from playing their best football.
Interesting. And then, of course, whoever loses the game, you can make up for it by beating Michigan. I know you've said,
That's right.
that's going to be a tall task, and certainly I think anyone who's watched Michigan this year would agree. But it's not the only game, but, man, it is a huge one. Cannot wait for the call with you and Gus and Jenny coming up here noon Eastern time on Saturday. Have a great one. Well, it did not go well for you initially, but you finished on a positive note. Give people who don't understand the intensity of this rivalry a sense for what it's all about.
I say this in a way of enjoyment because I like this. So Ohio State-Michigan is, in my opinion, the greatest rivalry in sports, and there's an overwhelming theme of respect. Frankly, but when it's Michigan State, you just heard those guys, right? There's little jabs at each other. Like it is like a brotherhood, It's your in-state rival. You're in the same state. There's hatred in this rivalry. There is a lot of emotion. It's an emotionally exhausting week. Both teams have such desire to win. Like the joy of your victory is equal to the pain of your loss when it comes to this matchup. It's one of those emotional games.
Michigan State, on paper, feels like they are overmatched in this game. Mm-hmm. To what extent can that emotion help give them a chance where kind of, at least when you look at it analytically, it doesn't feel like they would have one?
Spot on, right? Because if we sit here and we compare rosters and X's and O's, we don't have much to talk about. Michigan's the best team in the country, in my opinion. But the hatred can play a factor. We've seen crazy things. Like whenever you are in a rivalry game, anything can happen. Here's the key if you're Michigan State. You have to start fast. You have to stay in this game early. You have to keep this one close into the second quarter, through the first half, because then you can tip the pressure onto Michigan's sideline. You can start to instill some belief on your sideline. That in mind, I don't think they'll just go toe-to-toe and be able to accomplish that. If I'm Michigan State, I'm calling a lot of trick plays, a lot of gadget plays. I'm pulling out all the tricks. If I'm Michigan, I am prepared for anything and everything on special teams, on offense. You just want to, if you're Michigan, you can put this one away early, and it'll be really tough for Michigan State to come back.
It is a series where Michigan State has, to a certain extent, had its way. I mean, they've won 10 of the last 15 in the series. And you think about their recent history, each of the last 3 years, they have won a game against a ranked team when they are themselves unranked. This is the perfect scenario for what we've seen from Michigan State. Again, to your point, it's going to take a lot for them to figure out a way to pull it out. So that's a huge trophy game, rivalry game. We got another one, Floyd of Rosedale, Iowa, and Minnesota. The Hawkeyes go to honor Brian Bulaga before the game, the former Big Ten Offensive Lineman of the Year, Super Bowl champ with the Packers. The Schools America Needs Farmers honoree given to players who exemplify the tenacity, work ethic, and character of Iowa farmers. Jared DeVries, Robert Gallery, Dallas Clark among those who have been honored in prior seasons. Iowa is in the driver's seat in the West here. Minnesota has not looked great, but coming off of a bye, so maybe a chance to get things together a little bit, get a bit healthier. What do you see in this one?
So I think really we can start with what is this game going to be? And it'll be a close game. Why? Because Iowa doesn't blow anyone out, right? They're going to be in close games.
Every game's a close game.
So I really think the challenge then is for Minnesota is like you kind of have to play Iowa's game. Wisconsin threw it 50 times against Iowa. I just don't think that's the recipe to succeed here. You have to be okay with punting the ball as much as they are. You have to be okay playing in a close game as much as they are. Darius Taylor, let's see if he's healthy. boy, would that help to be able to hand the ball off to your talented running back. But on the defensive side of the ball, you look at Iowa, their run numbers are great. It's been a few explosives that have heavily skewed that. And I looked at the Wisconsin game. Guys were just out of position. You have to play gap sound defense if you're Joe Rossi in the Minnesota defense. But here's the deciding factor. LeVar Woods, special team coordinator for Iowa. We should say his name more often. Phil Parker, the defensive coordinator. Those guys are as good as it gets in the business. And it's tough to beat Iowa because of those two units.
It is surprising, to your point, how much Minnesota's defense has dropped off this year. But this is a game where, again, all due respect to Iowa, they're nationally ranked. They're in a great position right now. They're not going to overwhelm you offensively. I don't think this is a great secret. Last in the nation in total offense. So for Minnesota, your weakness goes against their weakness. Can you figure out a way in those other two phases, as you say, to not just stay in the game, but to get yourself in position perhaps to win it in the fourth quarter? We've got soccer coming up tonight, win away from a bowl. The challenge here, Jake, is that after the Indiana game, their opponent's winning percentage is the best in the Big Ten the rest of the way. And frankly, it's not even all that close. I mean, it's a very difficult schedule down the stretch. So they best get win number 6 here, just to kind of put themselves at ease. You see the schedule there. What do they need to do here against a Hoosiers team that's scuffling?
To me, this is like an emotional challenge, an energetic challenge. I mean, there's history in football to say it's really hard to win coming off a emotional victory the week before. I mean, just think about what they went through to come back down as much as they were in the fourth quarter, and you got to win. And, you know, guys are super emotional in their post-game pressers. Well, that's energy. It takes you a couple days to shake that off. And now you're going on the road to an Indiana team which is effectively a must-win this week for every reason we just said. But you got this game and then a bye. Like you see what I'm saying here, right? There's some mental and emotional challenges here. And look, here's the thing about Indiana. The record says one thing. They play extremely hard, okay? And it's a zero-sum game. Indiana, look, they're not talking about a bowl game right now. It's been a frustrating season. But my goodness, would this be the pain of Rutgers' loss is their joy if they can pull this thing off. Indiana's going to be ready to play. Rutgers has to match it. They got to start fast in this game.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting game. It feels like it's a little bit of desperation time for Indiana. I mean, I think you feel like, hey, this is a home game against a team that at the beginning of the year they certainly thought they could beat. Now, I think Rutgers has outperformed a lot of people's expectations. But if you're IU, you say to yourselves, hey, this is an opportunity here. It's an opportunity to get in the win column. To me, it's not unlike what happened with Illinois last week, going down to Maryland, right, where you kind of had your back up against the wall. And if there's any chance to salvage it, it has to start right now. So interesting game from a psychology point of view, no question about it. The dramatic conclusion of our show coming up.
Both teams are 3-3. Both teams are coming off a bye. They're both coming off a bye. So this is a big game as the winner is now focused on, hey, can we get to 6? Can we make a bowl game? It's important. It'll be an uphill battle for the loser. So Northwestern, they've lost 13 consecutive road games, right? So in order to win on the road, you need to run the football. Nebraska's defense is excellent against the run, so that'll be a challenge. And then for Northwestern's defense, can they stop the run? That hasn't exactly been a strong point. So I look at Harburg. I mean, he's really their best runner. They're averaging the most yards per carry in the conference. This is going to be a fun game from a matchup standpoint. Northwestern, can you put 4 quarters of good football together?
You mentioned it. No team in the nation averages fewer rushing yards in conference play than Northwestern does. So it's already tough to run it on Nebraska. And then you wonder about the health of their quarterback, Ben Bryant. So a lot of issues for the Wildcats heading into that one. Finally, Wisconsin and Illinois. I said this yesterday. This is a far more interesting game than it seemed like a week ago. Wisconsin coming off its lowest low of the year, I would say, losing at home to Iowa, and Illinois coming off its highest high after the road win against Maryland.
Illinois ascending. Wisconsin took a step back this week. That's the interesting thing here. You never want to turn one loss into 2, and that's an even bigger challenge for Wisconsin now without Tanner Mordecai. I think they threw it 50 times against Iowa. You got to give the ball to Braylon Allen in your backfield. You got to run the ball a little bit more. Get back to that Wisconsin smash mouth offense. But I'm going to give credit to Illinois. This is a huge opportunity. Took a step in the right direction, cleaned up some things. Can you continue that trend against a good Big Ten West foe?
Yeah, looked dramatically better.